black man in a crisp suit arrives at work on his first day as the new bank manager, but instead of a welcome, he's blocked by security and told to wait, asked who he's really here to see. Inside, his staff glance at him like he's in the wrong building. What would you do in that moment? Storm out? Prove yourself? Or would you do what he did, walk in anyway, say nothing, and quietly begin a transformation no one saw coming? He hadn't even stepped through the door before they decided who he wasn't. The moment Marcus Ellison placed his polished leather shoe on the first marble step of the prestige National Bank in downtown Chicago, something in the air shifted. The kind of shift you don't see but feel: cold glances, tightened posture, the faintest flick of judgment in a stranger's eyes. At exactly 8:56 a.m., the morning sun cast long golden lines across the lobby's grand chandeliers, but nothing about the welcome felt warm. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and carrying a well-worn briefcase with the initials M.E. embossed in silver, Marcus exhaled slowly before reaching for the door handle. It was his first official day as senior branch manager, a day meant to signal possibility, a beginning. But the moment he touched the glass, a voice sliced through the air like a snapped wire. "Sir, this entrance is for management only." The security guard stepped in front of him, firm, unblinking. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't respectful either. It was coated in that particular kind of doubt Marcus had grown far too familiar with. Marcus paused, eyebrows lifted in quiet disbelief. He had expected challenges eventually, but not in the first 60 seconds. "That's exactly why I'm here," Marcus replied, measured and polite, his voice deep and calm. He reached into his coat, pulling out the printed offer letter and executive badge he'd received just 3 days earlier. But the guard didn't move to read it. Instead, he squinted at Marcus's face, scanning him not for identity, but for contradiction. The unspoken message was deafening. A man who looks like you doesn't belong behind those doors. Inside the gleaming lobby, an eerie sort of awareness began to spread. Rachel, a teller behind the premium services desk, leaned over to her colleague and whispered something sharp, eyebrows raised. A junior banker near the espresso bar straightened his tie and watched the unfolding scene with thinly veiled amusement. Two women near the elevator stopped mid-conversation, exchanging glances that said everything and nothing. Marcus stood there, caught in a moment he hadn't created, but now had to own. He had faced situations like this before, in boardrooms, in hotel lobbies, on golf courses, but this was different. This time, the very institution that had chosen him was now hesitating to accept him. The guard finally took the papers, eyes darting across the top lines. His fingers hesitated, his breath caught. The expression on his face flickered confusion, followed by discomfort, followed by something dangerously close to shame. He cleared his throat, took a step back, and said, "Apologies, Mr. Ellison. Please go right in." But the damage had already seeped into the cracks. As Marcus walked across the marble floor, he could feel the invisible weight of 100 eyes. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to stare. Others met his gaze for a moment too long, as if still trying to reconcile what they'd just witnessed. The receptionist gave him a too sweet smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No one offered a warm welcome. No one stood up. The unspoken question clung to the air like humidity in summer. Who is this man? And why is he standing where he doesn't seem to belong? Every inch of the space was designed to intimidate: the towering ceilings, the precise symmetry of glass and gold, the chill of wealth and hierarchy hanging like perfume. But Marcus wasn't new to discomfort. What stunned him wasn't the resistance. It was how automatic it all was. The assumption, the dismissal, the choreography of prejudice was performed so casually that no one even realized they were participating in a dance. And yet, as he reached the executive suite doors and scanned his badge for the first time, Marcus didn't feel small. He didn't feel angry. What he felt was clarity. This was no longer just a job. It had become something more. It was a moment of reckoning, not for him, but for the culture that had quietly normalized exclusion beneath chandeliers and quarterly reports. He had spent a career earning respect, but now he understood this wasn't about achieving it. It was about redefining it. He walked into his office, placed the briefcase on the table, and sat in silence. The chair still carried the scent of the man who had left it behind. The window gave a perfect view of the Chicago skyline, rising fierce and unapologetic above the morning haze. He didn't need to announce himself. He didn't need applause or validation. What he needed, what he would demand through action, not ego, was transformation. And it would start here, in this building where no one expected him to lead. He would listen first, then dismantle what needed to be unlearned. He would meet cold shoulders with quiet integrity. He would let his values speak until the room had no choice but to hear them, because Marcus Ellison wasn't just here to run a branch. He was here to change how people saw themselves and how they saw each other. By the time the sun reached its peak that afternoon, no one remembered the man who'd been stopped at the door. But months later, they would all remember the day everything began to change. They didn't ask who he was. They decided who he wasn't. Even after the security guard finally let Marcus Ellison through the doors of Prestige National Bank, the walls didn't welcome him. The silence was thick, like a cold handshake withheld. Eyes shifted, but no one stepped forward to greet the new branch manager. His name had been sent in advance. His appointment had been announced in the executive newsletter. His credentials were indisputable. Yet somehow, to everyone in that polished marble lobby, he was still a question mark, a shadow, an outsider who must have walked in by mistake. He passed by the premium client lounge, where espresso machines purred quietly behind gold trim. One banker glanced at him, then at his watch, then back to his screen. A receptionist offered a nod that carried no warmth. Marcus had worked for decades for this moment. Ivy League education, federal finance appointments, regional leadership awards. But none of that entered the room before his skin color did. When he entered the elevator, a younger analyst hesitated before stepping in. Then, eyes darting to Marcus's suit and briefcase, I forced a polite smile and stood in the far corner. The ride to the executive floor was only 12 seconds, but long enough to feel every unspoken doubt. Long enough for Marcus to be reminded of the oldest truth he had grown up learning in quiet suburbs and polished campuses. There are places where your achievements precede you, and then there are places where your appearance must apologize for arriving first. At 9:11 a.m., Marcus opened the door to his new office. It was immaculate, untouched. The previous manager's plaques had been removed. A single framed welcome letter from the corporate VP rested on the desk, but Marcus didn't sit. He stood by the window, watching the skyline shimmer through the morning haze. He felt the weight of being both seen and unseen. Seen for what they assumed, unseen for all he had built. Later that morning, he joined his first senior staff meeting. As he entered the room, 5 department heads were already seated. Their conversation dipped instantly. One man stood, nodded stiffly, but didn't offer his hand. Another, glancing briefly at Marcus's ID badge, muttered, "Didn't expect a new manager so soon." A third simply blinked, then looked away. The fourth adjusted her glasses and began organizing papers, as though his presence was an interruption to routine. The fifth, the longest serving of them all, said nothing at all. Marcus took his seat, greeted each person by name, and opened his folder. But he felt it in the space between their words, the way they addressed each other with familiarity, then turned to him with formality and filtered caution. No one challenged his authority outright, but no one welcomed it either. The table wasn't rejecting his title, they were rejecting the truth of what that title represented in his body. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hate. It was something more insidious, the kind of deeply embedded doubt that isn't shouted but whispered through every sidelong glance, every interruption, every unsolicited explanation of things he already knew. It was the slow erosion of credibility, not because he was incapable, but because his competence required constant validation. They didn't say, "You're not good enough." They simply acted like he hadn't proven anything yet. By noon, he'd reviewed operational reports, personnel files, and customer retention data. His background in strategic transformation made it clear that the branch wasn't underperforming because of external market forces. The rot was internal. Processes were precise, but people were cold. Morale was sterile. Customers came for services but left without a connection. His team followed policies but not purpose. They executed tasks but did not care. This was not a failing institution, it was a drifting one, led by unspoken assumptions and guarded pride. Marcus knew that if he raised his voice now, he'd be labeled aggressive. If he pressed too hard, he'd be called defensive. So he chose another path, not to blend in, not to fight back, but to hold firm, to let his presence, his consistency, and his values redefine their expectations, one choice at a time. Over the next few days, he began scheduling one-on-one meetings with staff, not to command, but to connect. He listened to what they believed the branch stood for. He asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask. Some were startled, some were polite, but distant. One even said, "No offense, but I didn't think someone like you would be interested in my input." Marcus smiled, steady and unshaken. "I'm not interested in your title," he replied. "I'm interested in your truth." And slowly, in the space left by assumptions, something new began to grow. Curiosity, respect, awareness. But on that first day, what he remembered most wasn't the policy briefings or the executive desk or the skyline from the 34th floor. What stayed with him was the unmistakable chill of being measured, not by who he was, but by who others refused to believe he could be. And that was precisely why he was the right man to change everything. They thought he would break. They were wrong. By the end of his second week at Prestige National, Marcus Ellison had become something of a silent legend for reasons no one would say aloud. He had been tested quietly and consistently. Meeting invites were sent with just minutes to spare. The directives he gave were met with smiles, but then ignored. His ideas, drawn from a lifetime of hard-won experience, were summarized, reworded, and passed off as someone else's during boardroom briefings. He could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for him to snap, to throw a paperweight, to raise his voice, and prove their silent assumptions right, that he was too proud, too inexperienced, too different to lead this branch. But Marcus didn't play that game. He didn't walk faster, didn't speak louder, didn't tap his title like a shield. He let them perform their doubts like rehearsed monologues, while he stayed still enough to read the spaces between their lines. What they mistook for silence was strategy. What they mistook for patience was calculation. What they didn't understand was that Marcus had lived this before, again and again, and in much harder rooms than this. The more they pushed, the more he slowed, and that slowness began to unnerve them. One Monday morning, as the team filed into their usual leadership huddle, they found the long conference table cleared of laptops and documents. In their place, a stack of blank note cards and pens. No agenda. No graphs. Just silence. Marcus entered last. Calm, deliberate, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture effortless. He walked to the head of the table, didn't sit, and asked a single question. "What do you fear most about failing here?" Silence. Then scoffs. Someone laughed under their breath. Another checked their phone. "I'm serious," he said again, gently. "What are you afraid of losing if this place changes?" It was disarming, not because the question was aggressive, but because it was true. And truth, when unexpected, hits like thunder in a still sky. They didn't answer right away, but over the following days those cards reappeared on desks, scribbled in handwriting no one wanted to admit was their own words, like control, relevance, reputation, comfort. Marcus never called anyone out. He didn't need to. He simply began to create space where fear was no longer required to hide. And once fear was named, something else emerged: room for responsibility. That Friday, without announcing it, he joined the custodial team on their early morning walkthrough. He arrived at 5:20 a.m., dressed not in his usual navy, but in gray slacks and a short-sleeved polo. He greeted the janitor, by name Luis, someone he'd researched weeks before. They walked the hallways together, checking the lights and tidying paper trays. For 20 minutes, no one noticed. Then, when the first employees trickled in, They saw him wiping fingerprints from a glass door. For the first time, they didn't know how to react. Some nodded stiffly, others turned away. But one intern, barely 3 weeks on the job, paused, stared, and whispered to her colleague, "He's cleaning the building he runs." It wasn't a performance. He wasn't documenting it for LinkedIn. It was a message, spoken in a language too few leaders dare to use: service. And that moment rewrote the rules of power in that building. By the third week, the whispers changed. They no longer asked, "How long do you think he'll last?" Instead, they began asking, "How long have we misunderstood him?" Marcus never pointed fingers. He asked questions. He never demanded an apology. He offered an opportunity. He didn't correct people in public. He gave them space to get themselves together. One afternoon, a senior finance officer who had openly dismissed his presence walked into Marcus's office unannounced. The man closed the door behind him, hesitated, then said, "I want to learn how you're doing this. You have people listening, and they're not even sure why. But it's working, and I want in." Marcus smiled, not as a victor, but as a teacher who sees a student finally ready. "I'm not changing the system," he said. "I'm changing the silence that protects it." And he was. By choosing stillness over force, humility over ego, and listening over lecturing, Marcus didn't just shift his behavior, he turned his belief. And that, boss, is how you lead a building full of people who doubted you. Not by fighting them, but by becoming undeniable. No one expected a training program to begin with a funeral. On his fourth week at Prestige National, Marcus sent out an all-staff invite titled simply, "Legacy Session, Conference Room B, Mandatory." The title confused some. A few rolled their eyes. Training sessions were nothing new. They were used to them: long slideshows, policy jargon, the kind of corporate fog that filled a room without changing anything. But Marcus had done nothing by the book so far, and deep down, they knew this would be different. At precisely 9 a.m., the door closed, the lights dimmed, and on the screen appeared not a graph, not a title slide, but a photograph, grainy, black and white. A man in his 40s standing outside a brick bank in 1961, holding a rejection letter. The caption, "He wasn't allowed to open an account, so he built his bank." The room fell silent. Marcus stood beside the screen. No podium, no script, just him, speaking in a voice that held no performance, only gravity. "We've inherited more than desks and ledgers here," he began. "We've inherited silence, the kind that protects comfort at the cost of truth." Then he told them a story they had never heard before, about the man in the photo, his grandfather, denied entry to this very branch 6 decades ago, not because he lacked income, but because he lacked the one thing required at that time to be trusted: whiteness. The discomfort in the room was instant, palpable, but Marcus didn't flinch. He walked them through the history of exclusion in banking, how policies were once designed not just to manage money, but to keep certain people from having it. He didn't accuse, he revealed. He didn't shame, he invited. Then he turned off the screen and handed each person a sheet of paper. On it, one question: "What are we still doing that would have denied my grandfather?" They weren't asked to answer out loud, just to think. And the thinking didn't stop when they left that room. In the weeks that followed, change began, but not the kind anyone could have predicted. A young teller named Devon, barely 23, approached Marcus after hours. He asked if he could start a bias reflection board in the break room, a wall where anonymous notes could be posted about moments when someone felt dismissed, unheard, or misjudged. Marcus approved it instantly. By the end of the week, the wall was complete. A veteran advisor, Susan, who had once openly questioned Marcus's qualifications, requested to host a roundtable on ethical lending, citing a client story that had haunted her for years. She said, "I'm tired of watching people walk away thinking we only see their credit scores." Marcus supported her. He didn't take credit. He simply made room. Then, one afternoon, came a moment no one could have scripted. The regional director, a man known for his ironclad professionalism and spotless compliance records, walked unannounced into the branch for a surprise evaluation. Employees froze. Everyone knew what these visits meant: checklists, audits, judgment. Marcus greeted him with the same calm that had become his signature and offered a tour not of numbers, but of people. They walked past the break room, where Devon's bias board stood crowded with notes. The director paused. "And this?" he asked. "A mirror," Marcus replied. "It shows us more than metrics ever could." The director said nothing, just nodded. But days later, Marcus received an email, a quiet one. No praise, no exclamation, just 4 words: "Bring this branch blueprint." The message was clear. What he'd started was no longer an experiment. It was a model. And yet, even in success, Marcus remained still, not complacent but rooted. When the compliments began to come, he deflected. When his name was mentioned in internal memos, he reminded his team, "This is not about me. It's about what we build together." The most shocking transformation didn't come from upper leadership or external recognition. It came from within the staff themselves. People who once hid behind job titles began speaking like humans again. Staff meetings ended with questions like, "Who haven't we heard from yet?" instead of just sales targets. A banker who once dismissed the front desk staff began shadowing them every week. The hierarchy was still there, but the separation wasn't. What Marcus created wasn't a training program. It was a quiet revolution dressed in professionalism, one that didn't scream to be noticed, but whispered until people couldn't ignore the truth any longer. And it worked, because no one saw it coming. They had expected retribution. Instead, they got restoration. They had braced for a war. Instead, they found a teacher. That's how systems change, not with fire, but with clarity. And Prestige National would never be the same again. It happened during the one meeting Marcus didn't expect to go wrong. A leadership roundtable, his idea. A simple, open invitation to talk about what the bank could become. No hierarchy, no agenda, just people in a room, off script. He'd watched the staff start to soften over the weeks, begin to engage. He thought they were ready. But what unfolded that afternoon wasn't dialogue. It was a backlash. Susan, a longtime senior advisor with tenure older than some employees' children, sat back in her chair, arms crossed, and said in a slow, sharp tone, "Let's be honest. This culture shift you're trying to create, it's a theater. It doesn't match the pressure we're under. You want empathy, and we need numbers." The room fell silent. No one came to Marcus's defense. Rachel looked down at her notebook. Devon young, idealistic. Devon clenched his jaw but said nothing. Even the assistant branch manager who had once praised Marcus's leadership seemed to shrink into his collar. The message was loud, even without an echo. "You're pushing too far, too fast." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He let Susan's words hang in the air like smoke, suffocating but revealing. He stood, quietly walked to the window, and looked out at the city. Then he turned around, slow and steady, and said, "You're right." The room twitched in confusion. "It is theater," he continued, "but not the kind you think. This branch has been running the same play for years. One where customers smile while we push numbers they don't understand. Where staff smile through exhaustion because asking for help feels like a sign of weakness. And where leaders nod politely while ignoring the truth. I'm rewriting that script. That's my theater." Before anyone could speak, he walked out, just like that. No explanation, no defense. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Marcus had already drafted a proposal to corporate that very morning, a complete overhaul of the branch's performance review model. He wanted to tie employee bonuses not just to financial targets, but to peer recognition, ethical behavior, and team mentorship, a radical idea, quietly submitted, still waiting for approval. That evening, he stayed late, not in his office, but in the empty customer lobby. Lights low, shoes off, sitting on the cold marble floor beneath the chandelier. His fingers touched the edge of the polished stone, and he wondered if this whole thing would collapse under the weight of its resistance. And that's when something unexpected happened. The security guard, Andre, who had once blocked his entry on day one, approached quietly and said, "I heard what she said to you. That wasn't right." Marcus looked up. surprised. Andre continued, I've been here 12 years and never seen anyone clean out the break room fridge without being asked. You did that. You think no one sees it, but some of us do. Giziola. Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. The next morning, the fridge was spotless again and not by Marcus. Then something strange began to happen, little things. On Monday, Devon pushed his lunch back to help the new hire without being asked. On Tuesday, Susan left a sticky note on Marcus's desk that said, I may not agree with everything, but I'm listening. On Wednesday, Rachel started greeting customers by name and asking about their day, not out of training, but out of genuine curiosity. By Thursday, the human hour had gone from a small experiment to a full-branch ritual. Even the most skeptical staff showed up, sometimes just to listen. The story that had started with resistance now pulsed with unexpected energy. But the real twist came the following Friday. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Marcus received an encrypted email. Subject line, approved. His reform proposal, controversial, untested, quietly ridiculed in whispers, had not only passed, but was greenlit for pilot implementation across 3 additional branches. No one had told him it was under review. He opened the document and scrolled to the final line, handwritten. Culture doesn't scale easily, but courage does. Keep going. He printed the email, walked to the bulletin board, and pinned it beside the bias reflection wall. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't make a speech. He simply left it there, for those who cared enough to notice. And they did, because something had changed not just in systems or routines, but in the air itself. People walked differently now, looked at each other longer, said thank you without rushing off. Marcus had never raised his voice. He had never threatened, but he had changed the temperature of the room by refusing to let it stay cold. Those who doubted him the most were the first to ask how he did what he did, and the branch that once resisted the man at the door had now started asking, what if we built this everywhere? What began as a challenge had become a movement, and no one saw it coming. It was never the applause that mattered, not the emails from corporate, not the sudden policy shifts bearing his name, not even the quiet acknowledgments whispered in passing. What changed everything for Marcus Ellison was the silence. Not the silence of being ignored, but the kind that falls over a room when someone walks in and every person there, whether they stand or not, straightens their spine, not out of obligation, but out of respect. That was the kind of silence that greeted Marcus now. On his 73rd day as branch manager, he walked through the front doors of Prestige National, as he always did, early, composed, without spectacle. But this time, something felt different. It wasn't the uniforms, or the sunlight bouncing off the marble floors, or the faint scent of brewed coffee. It was the eyes. They met his not quickly and nervously as they had in those early weeks, not dismissively as they once had, but steadily, clearly, with a quiet kind of awe that no title could demand and no speech could earn. He paused at the center of the lobby, not to hold court, but to take in the space he now recognized, not just as a workplace, but as a reflection. This was no longer the bank that braced itself against his presence. It had become a place that opened around it. Susan, once his sharpest critic, crossed the floor with 2 coffee cups in hand. She handed him one without a word, but her eyes said everything. Not an apology, something more rare, understanding. A shared truth now lived between them. The journey had reshaped them both. Devon stood beside the new intern, explaining a process Marcus himself had restructured. He didn't name drop. He didn't say, Marcus's policy. He simply taught it like it belonged to the culture now, not the man. And that was how Marcus knew the change had taken root. But the moment that truly rewired him came that same afternoon. A client came in, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and 2 children in tow. Her voice was clipped with stress as she approached the teller window, visibly embarrassed as she fumbled with documents. Marcus was walking past when he saw it. The hesitation in the teller's posture, the kind of pause he knew too well, the moment where a person in power measures patience against productivity. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The teller, Rachel, once reserved, once skeptical, smiled gently, stepped around the counter, and knelt beside the woman to help her fill out the form. No sigh, no judgment, just kindness so natural it didn't even feel like kindness anymore. It felt like standard. That night, Marcus stayed long after the last light clicked off. He walked the halls alone, not to inspect, but to remember. Each step echoed through the halls that once echoed with his doubt. He passed the room where he had once stood and been openly challenged. He passed the break room fridge that had become its strange symbol of dignity. He stood at the bias board, now framed in wood, cleaned weekly, and still covered in fresh, anonymous notes that spoke truth with no fear. Then he went to the lobby and sat where the security guard had first stopped him, where eyes had once measured his worth in suspicion, and that's when Andre, the same guard, came over and sat beside him. No words at first, just the stillness between two men who had seen each other on both sides of a door. "You changed this place," Andre said finally. Marcus shook his head, not in denial but in defiance of credit. "I just held up a mirror," he said. "They changed themselves." Andre let out a breath. "Still, I used to watch people flinch when you walked in. Now they look at you like you built this floor." Marcus looked down at the marble beneath them. "No," he said quietly. "We just cleaned it off. The foundation was always here." And then came the moment Marcus never could have predicted. As he stood to leave, he turned and saw nearly the entire staff gathered at the edge of the mezzanine above no applause, no clapping, just watching. One by one they began to descend the stairs. Not rehearsed and not planned. Like gravity, drawing them toward the center of what they had, all unknowingly, helped rebuild. Susan approached first and spoke softly. "You came in through that door a stranger to all of us. And now, you're the reason we walk through it differently." And for the first time in 73 days, Marcus Ellison allowed himself to feel it fully. Not pride, not triumph, but a profound release. Because now, finally, they didn't just respect the manager, they honored the man. In the end, no one remembered the numbers. No one quoted the profit margin for the third quarter or the upward trend in customer retention graphs. What remained etched not on paper, but on the human heart, was how it felt to work in a place where people mattered again. Marcus Ellison had never asked for admiration. He'd avoided it. To him, leadership wasn't about standing in front, but about walking beside. It was about holding the door open long enough for someone else to realize they could step through it with dignity. Yet somehow, without ever seeking it, Marcus had become something rare. He had become the measure by which integrity was silently recalibrated in the building. What began with resistance had become reverence, but not the shallow kind. This was respect born not from charisma, but from character. And the people who had once whispered doubts now told stories about the way he remembered birthdays, the way he paused to hear, not just respond, the way he never confused silence with absence or status with worth. That morning, the branch held its quarterly all-staff assembly, now renamed by popular vote as the Circle. Chairs in a round, no head table, no podiums, just voices. The theme, legacy in motion. Everyone expected Marcus to speak. He always did calm, thoughtful, never grandiose. But that morning, he surprised them. He stood, nodded politely, and said only this: "Today, I won't speak, because the greatest change I ever led now speaks without me." Then he sat down, and for a long moment, no one moved, until Susan, once the loudest resistor, stood slowly. Her voice, once sharp with doubt, now trembled with memory. "I used to think we were here to win," she said, eyes lowered, "to outperform, outsell, outshine. But now I realize I was afraid. Afraid to slow down, afraid to care too much, afraid to ask myself what it meant to be good, not just at the job, but as a person inside it." She paused. No one interrupted. "When Marcus came, I saw a man I didn't expect, and I judged him because of it. But he didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He stayed. And in staying, he became a mirror none of us wanted, but all of us needed." The room was still, not out of formality, but out of reverence. Then Devon, with his usual energy, added softly, "He made it okay not to have all the answers, but also made it impossible not to ask better questions." Tears came not performative, not dramatic. just quiet recognition that something had shifted, that somehow, through the small, persistent choices of a man who had once been turned away at the door, they had all found a way back to themselves. Even Andre, the security guard, spoke that day. From the back of the room, he said, "Some people protect buildings. Marcus protected our humanity." And no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes, because they knew it was true. After the meeting, Marcus stepped outside, not for air, for perspective. The city moved as it always did, impatient and sprawling, but in that moment, it felt like the branch behind him breathed differently, as if the walls, once rigid with structure and status, had softened into something more human. That's when a delivery driver stopped him. A man he'd never met, holding a box of printer paper. "You, Mr. Ellison?" the man asked. "I am." The driver smiled. "Heard about you. They said this place used to feel cold. Not anymore." Marcus smiled, small and humble. "They give you awards for that?" the driver asked. Marcus looked back at the building. "No, but I get to show up every day and know I didn't change the system by force. I changed the people who run it, and they'll change it now, with or without me." That was the moment. Not the headlines that would later come, not the regional award he never mentioned, not the boardroom that would soon call him to consult on culture reform. It was that moment with a man whose name he didn't know, who'd felt the warmth in a place once known for its chill that told Marcus the truth. He hadn't just fixed a branch, he'd awakened it. And through that awakening, he had done what no policy ever could. He turned an institution into a living thing. Something that I remembered, something that listened, something that grew. Not because he led them there, but because he reminded them that they could lead each other. Some stories entertain, stories that inspire, and then some stories stay with us, not because of how dramatic they are, but because they quietly speak to something we've always known deep down, that who you are matters more than what you do. And that's how you treat people, especially when no one's watching, defines your real legacy. Marcus Ellison's story isn't just about changing a bank. It's about changing how we show up when we're misunderstood, underestimated, or quietly dismissed. It's about choosing grace over ego, steadiness over reaction, and character over performance. He walked into a place where no one expected him to last, and instead of fighting for authority, he earned trust through his presence. Not by raising his voice, but by holding his ground with calm dignity. Not by proving people wrong, but by giving them the space to grow into something better. And over time, that consistency, day after day, shifted the entire environment around him. The people who once looked past him began to look to him, not because he demanded it, because he became undeniable. We live in a world that often confuses strength with noise. But Marcus taught us something else. Real strength is quiet. It's measured in how we respond to pressure, how we treat people who can't give us anything, and how we hold the line of who we are, even when it's uncomfortable. So, what can we learn from him? You don't need power to create change. You have to have clarity. You don't need everyone to agree with you. You just need to stay true to your values long enough for them to see your light. And most importantly, you don't lead with your title. You lead with your example. Maybe right now, you're in a place where your presence feels invisible. Perhaps you're surrounded by people who haven't yet recognized your worth. Maybe you're quietly carrying more weight than anyone realizes. If that's you, we want you to know your integrity is never wasted, even if no one applauds, even if no one notices right away. Keep going. Because in time, the people around you will stop watching what you do and start reflecting who you are. That's the kind of influence no policy can mandate, no manager can fake. That's the kind of influence that lasts. So today, we leave you with this. Lead by being the kind of person you'd want to follow. Speak less, but mean more. Listen deeper. Notice the ones who are overlooked. And when it gets hard, then it will remember that the most significant change happens not when you shift systems, but when you shift hearts. If this story resonated with you, we'd love for you to join our growing community. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that center on character, compassion, and quiet courage. Drop us a comment and let us know what part of Marcus's journey spoke to you most. And please don't stop here. There's more to discover. Watch our next video and let the lessons continue to unfold. Thank you for watching, and wherever today finds you, may it also remind you of this simple truth. You have more power than you realize, especially when you choose to use it with kindness. We'll see you in the following story. Until then, stay grounded, stay human, and may your day be filled with purpose.